Hello and welcome. I'm John Ball, the founder and CTO of Patom, and today I want to take you through the science of the brain, neuroscience, and look at what it predicts in terms of artificial intelligence or cognitive science. What is it that we can do to improve cognitive science by using neuroscience? And how I'm going to contrast this is we'll look at some of the theories of the past, the scientific theories of the past that took a while to get right. And with AI, I think it's fair to say we've taken a while to get this right because AI has been going since the late 1950s, if not before. And a lot of the things that we'd like to see haven't yet come to fruition. So we'll talk about that. And I'm going to compare the recent paper by Yann Lecun, the Turing Award winner and Facebook AI research lead. I think he's now the Meta research lead, and just see what it is that he's proposing for the next generation to solve artificial intelligence problems, and how you can compare that with the model that I'm going to present tonight. Okay, so this is probably a good place to start with science. I often talk about epicycles in astronomy because for over 1,000 years, humanity struggled with a solution to explain planetary motion. It was obvious that planets revolved around the Earth and the Earth was stationary because, well, we didn't fall over, we weren't in motion, you can't feel that we're moving. And it's probably fair to say even 350 BC, or whenever Aristotle was around, he was able to deal with these types of problems, and he knew that the Earth was round. For example, there's a lot of interesting knowledge that was available even back that long ago. But let's have a look at what an epicycle is to understand how the constraints on a scientific theory are not a good starting point. It's better to just have a very open mind as to what the possible answers could be. And this will become relevant later. So here, let's make this as big as possible. So Ptolemy, this is about 100 AD or something. He was using epicycles to, maybe I can move the correct screen. He was using epicycles to explain planetary motion. And you can see here that with the Earth as a unmoving point, and this beautiful circular orbit here, it wasn't explaining the motion of the planet. So you put the planet on this circle and then the planet moves backwards and forwards. Let's see if we can get a slightly better view of that. So here you can see as the planet moves around the epicycle, you're getting some forward and backward motion in relation to the Earth. And as a result, that's a more effective model. Here we go. There's the next generation of this model. So when your scientific model doesn't work, one of the ways to pivot is simply to extend it. And so if the single epicycle is not working, put a second one on and see how that goes. And so here you can see an epicycle on an epicycle, and this still didn't work, but it was slightly better and it was dealing with the constraints that were put on the system. But what were the constraints? Let's see, these ideas were so ingrained. So let's see, the fact that ancient astronomers could convince themselves that this elaborate scheme still corresponded to uniform circular motion is testament to the power of three ideas that we now know to be completely wrong. These ideas were so ingrained into the known cultural truth of this age that they were essentially never questioned. So here's the scientific pitfall if you're not careful. 1, all motion in the heavens is uniform circular motion. Why is that? Well, circles are perfect, aren't they? All objects in heaven are made from perfect material and cannot change their intrinsic properties, for example, brightness. And 3, the Earth is at the center of the universe. So a lot of justification for that, but we'll come back to the concept of the epicycle model later on because it's so important to scientific theory. If you put in a constraint and that constraint's wrong, it's very hard to solve the problem. So let's go and have a look at one of the people I like in the AI field, Gary Marcus. Gary is a New York University professor, entrepreneur, various things. This is his channel on Substack, and it's talking about the road to AI we can trust. So Gary's very keen on designing things that we already know have pitfalls, so that we don't keep making the same mistakes that we already know would be a mistake if we followed that line of reasoning. And he's talking here about the difference between innateness and learning. So today, many people in the deep learning community and the machine learning community are very enthusiastic about the prospects of learning everything. And while there has been a lot of success in some of the applications of machine learning, there's also some problems and some things that aren't progressing at anything like the rate required to get us to human level intelligence, to human level capability. And probably capability is a better term to use today, rather than intelligence, because intelligence is hard to apply to some of the problems that AI is being applied to. But here's Gary's 5 myths about learning and innateness. 1, if you believe in innateness, you don't believe in meaning. 2, if you believe in learning, you should oppose innateness. 3, the more things are learned, the less we need innateness, etc. So Gary's saying, and I think this is a good article for you to look at after my talk tonight, he's explaining things that are myths about learning and innateness. And as you go through his article here, he's talking about work from Chomsky, Pinker, etc., which explain their views of learning and innateness. And there has been a lot of debates about, Chomsky's learning acquisition device and so forth. And the ideas on the surface might sound crazy in some cases, but when you read the detail, you'll realize, okay, well, maybe you still think it's crazy, but maybe it's not as crazy as you think when you understand it in a bit more detail. I'm more interested in the brain and language, the applications specifically of language, because it's, if language was innate, well, we wouldn't be learning it. And if we were innately gifted with some features, well, maybe languages would be more similar. I don't know. But there's some certain things about the brain that are definitely innate, and there's certain things that we seem to learn. Let's just have a look at that in a bit more detail now. So here's Patom theory. We'll start off with my brain theory that I developed from the 80s through till about 2000. And at that point in 2000, the model was pretty mature, and I've simply worked off this model to the present in order to implement cognitive science, or the background for natural language understanding. So linguistics and the cognitive sciences that go into understanding language. You can see here in my book, and by the way, tonight I'll be giving references in the comment section for all of these references that I'm going to use. So here's my book from 1998. I think we revised it in 2016. So here's the Amazon version. So the model of the brain is that there's the sensory experience, and the sensory experience is going to be picked up by transducers. So in the human case, we've got 2 eyes that are picking up vision, but we also have other, we've got ears. Inside our ears, we've got these semicircular canals and other very cool transducers that give us balance. So the things which are very important to being able to walk are our semicircular canals. It's interesting to look at that as another sense. We've got the sense of touch. We've got our taste, so there's a lot of different senses, and if you break them down into their component parts, there's probably more than the 5 senses that we normally talk about. So when you get to the 6th sense, you're probably talking about balance and so on. So each one of these transducers is converting some sort of physical experience into nervous impulses, and there's neurons in these transducers in any case. So I'd like to think of the brain starting at the edge being these transducers, and then continuing on into the brain itself. And there's some amazing online resources that I'm going to be relying on next, just to get a better feel for the human brain and then the contrast with other types of animal brains. because it's relevant for AI. So if you consider what a cat is doing, what a dog is doing, what a fish is doing, and then you realize that the capabilities of those exceed our current AI in many respects, and they're the building blocks of our brain, we need to think about how we can emulate those and probably stop calling it intelligence, because I think that the ability for a shark to swim, for example, isn't what we would call motion intelligence. It's probably more motion capability, and humans have motion capability on the ground. So that's again why I don't like AI as the only term that we're using here to describe human capability. So in our brain, the eyes are mapping to brain material, and I call them in those days machine intelligence memory. These days I'd call them like pattern atom storage. But think of it as a brain region where we're storing information from the eye. And then inside the brain, you can go from that information in the eye to more specific types of patterns that you're picking up from that information from the eye. So in the eye, there's V1, which is the main area that is in our cortex. It then projects onto V2, V3, V4, V5, V6, and other areas. And each of those areas has unique specialties that's very valuable for us to recognize vision. And then those project onto another area. And I'm showing that here. At the time I originally wrote this, I didn't know exactly what the anatomy looked like, but it does come together into a combination. In theory, it could be, you could combine vision with auditory before you combine with other things. In practice, the senses tend to come together in one space, which we'll look at in a little while. So on this right side of the equation, we've got multisensory recall. So if you were to take all of your senses and combine them together for, say, the recognition of a cat, that concept of a cat might be a specific pattern atom, and when you go the other way back to the senses, that can be our memory for a cat. So what it smells like, what it feels like, what it sounds like, what it looks like when it's moving, all of that can come from the definition or the pattern for cat. And that's the main difference that I can see between a computer model and a pattern theory model. In a computer model, you try and encode all of that information and then store it into a database somewhere. You'd encode your visual information, maybe store it as MPEG, and then associate your MPEG somehow to a computer record, which involves the name of the cat and so forth. In pattern theory, you're simply assembling these different patterns based on co-occurrence, on happening at the same time. And as a result, the brain is extremely flexible in combining any sensory information or multisensory information together. And that's why pattern theory is finished up with sequences and sets as the driving force for it. So if you're at this level here, the MIM combined space that's representing cat, it can be, in theory, it could be a single neuron that's indicating that. And the reverse links that then run back through to the eyes and so forth, that then gives you this multisensory experience, or the recall of that multisensory experience, albeit not, with the same intensity that we first experienced it, because it's not now coming through our senses, it's coming through a stored representation of that. So that's pattern theory and how it differs. Let's have a look at the brain. This brain.facts.org site, I think, is pretty awesome. You can see here in this emulation area, we're able to rotate the brain, and by clicking on these areas, we can get the details as to what's going on there. So the cerebellum, for example, is this piece at the back of our skulls, and it's involved in fine motor control. You can see it's got a lot of neurons, 70 billion neurons. It does resemble a cauliflower, and it's important for things like playing the piano, hitting a home run, so sports and those types of fine motion skills. So you can have a look at what's going on with the cerebellum and the other things that I showed simply by coming to this page. Let's go back to one of the cerebral hemispheres here. So in our brain, we've got, let's There's the back. We've got a left and a right. In the right hemisphere, what's it saying here? 16 billion neurons. Glia cells help connect them, and I think help guide them into place. And these have the famous 6 layers of neurons. Some of the layers project forward, some project back, some are going up and down. And in pattern theory, we say that these regions in the cortex are storing, matching, and using patterns. And those patterns are hierarchical and bidirectional. Why are they bidirectional? Because they project forward and back. And interestingly, that theoretical approach came before. I'd seen Jeff Hawkins' work where he was explaining the anatomy in more detail than I'd seen in other resources, such as the different layers that project forward and back. So that's the right hemisphere. The left hemisphere is in about 95% of right-handers where language is stored, and in about, interestingly, 75% of left-handers, language is also centralized on the left side of our brain. I'm just indicating roughly Wernicke's area and roughly Broca's area. However, we can have a look here, just going through the model, and potentially select those key pieces here. There's Wernicke's area. You can see it being highlighted there. Much better than my vague wavings. And Broca's area at the back of the frontal area. In fact, I think we're near the premotor cortex and the motor cortex. Let's have a look at that in a moment. But the main features here, Broca's area was known as the area that was enabling speech. So if that's badly damaged, you can't speak properly, presumably, in my opinion, because that's the location where the complex sequences of muscular control are stored in order to pronounce words. And that then connects to the premotor cortex and the area of the motor cortex that controls motion. What does it say here? A small region. It's mainly in the left hemisphere, as I said. Okay. And Wernicke's is the area that is related to not being able to understand what somebody's saying, or in writing and also in reading and also in speech, interestingly. Okay, so let's just have a look at a couple of other areas. As I was saying, that the transducers, the eyes, ears, nose, etc., that connect to our brain are part of the brain, and those connect through what we can see down here are cranial nerves. So the nervous system's also part of the brain because it's the part that's connecting, for example, to the skin, to our muscles, and so on. So here we've got the optic nerve. It carries visual signals from the retina to the thalamus for conscious perception, and also to the brainstem. It could be that we want to do unconscious things, but the reality is that the brain has evolved over billions of years. I think if you go back to the first animals that had something that started as an early type of brain, and then in the evolution to human beings, some of these things have gotten a lot better, but some of the old things that still perform some useful function are still in place. So why, if you were a designer, would you have the eyes projecting to a new part of the brain, the occipital lobe, and then another part projecting to the brainstem directly? Maybe there's a different function going on in the brainstem that is useful for survival. And pattern theory just assumes that however the anatomy is put together is going to help us with the things that we learn. And so there's the segue to what we were talking about at the beginning of this. So what's innate, and what's innate and what's learned? Yes, there. So the innate bit is going to be the connection from the eyes to the brain. Now, there can be some changes to that as we grow. For example, in the 1950s and early 60s, there were experiments on cats where they blocked off the vision from one of the eyes of the cat, and they demonstrated that if you do that at a very early age, the cat never develops the connections from the eye to the brain correctly and effectively becomes blind. And in an adult cat, that didn't happen. So I'm not condoning the use of animals for experimentation by any means, but it's in the historical record. So that's how we know that doing things at an early age, there is learning involved, or the brain growth is still going on after we're born. And things that we also know about, like our long-term memories, continue in throughout our lives. So that's the cranial nerve. We can look at a couple of other things. The reason I like looking at these is because you also get an idea of what people think the brain is doing. So here's the primary auditory cortex. It's interpreting sounds. It detects high-frequency sounds on one end, and neurons at the other end are detecting low-frequency sounds. When you realize that the brain material in our cortex is pretty much all the same, the reason that there's this particular pattern is going to be because the wiring, the connections from our ear are projecting into particular areas in our cortex, and as a result, you see these types of patterns where you're getting this localization of different features. Let's see. Damage to the primary auditory cortex leads to the loss of conscious awareness of sound, but leaves reflexive hearing intact. It's certainly an interesting feature that people who are blind because of loss of V1 can still recognize objects, even though they have to say, "I don't know what it is, but I guess it's a pen." Okay. Let me just see if there was one or two other areas that are of interest here. The cortex is the area on the outside of our brain, but there's actually some interesting inner structures as well. Pons, medulla. So the earliest part of the brain in evolutionary terms, the medulla and pons are at the bottom of our brain. There's the cerebellum behind it. And then in here we've got midbrain and other types of interesting structures that then in humans continue the development quite significantly. Let's see if we can we get inside there? No, we have to select it through the menu. The entorhinal cortex is one that I've found quite remarkable, because this is an area where the senses are all converging, and it's right near the hippocampus where our episodic long-term memories are keyed off. Why do we say that? Well, some human medical procedures in the past, a very famous one, I think it was the whole hippocampus that was removed from both sides to deal with an epilepsy problem. And the person then, for the rest of their lives, never learned any new episodic memories. So the people that met him, her, never were remembering after a very short period of time. So these components, we know a bit about what they do. And as a result of that, and with Patom theory, what you would say is that that hippocampus and the areas that it's connecting are connecting back to the memories that were involved in that episode, in the event. And as a result of that, you remember all of your old memories because they live in the original position, the sensory area where they were first captured. And then they're still held together before the hippocampus, but you're not able to connect new episodic memories because that's the function of that part of the brain, to connect back to the elements in the event. So that's the entorhinal cortex. I actually found out about that through this fellow, Walter Freeman. That's quite an interesting book, How Brains Make Up Their Minds. I discovered that, when was it written? 1999. So this was one of the last reference books that I found, and it was very interesting that his anatomy was able to explain how that works, how the brain is put together with that. Just see if there's anything else we can look at. The amygdala is the famous area that has to do with emotions. Hippocampus, we talked about that. It's responsible for long-term memory, like your wedding day. Now, here it says it communicates with the rest of the brain via the entorhinal cortex. Okay, good. The hippocampus produces new neurons even in adults, while the rest of the brain stops growing early in childhood. So, for the reason that we can continue to learn new episodic memories throughout our lives. Let's see. Hippocampus also creates mental maps of places, which makes it easy to navigate in a complex environment. This is spatial memory. Oh, okay, maybe. So the concept here that it's communicating with the rest of the brain, that's a computational model. I don't like that so much. If it's communicating with the rest of the brain, it's not sending an encoded signal that says, here's the event that I've now got in a video and I'm going to send it out to the rest of the brain. This amazing type of video that includes how it felt and what you were seeing, what your body was doing, all of that type of stuff would be a very complex concept to give some sort of computer responsibility for. But if you're signaling back to the patterns that came to you in the first place and connecting all of that together, then that's quite plausible and something that we can implement on today's computers by emulating that type of cognitive science. So all in all, Thalamus, actually this will probably tell us about sending and shunting information around the brain. The thalamus, located in the middle of the brain, relays information about most of our senses. Yeah, so here's the computational model in practice. If you're going to relay information, you're encoding the information and sending it, as opposed to linking patterns together through the thalamus. Now, it's possible that some of the early brain structures, in fact, are more blocking noisy information to be sent to other parts of the brain, or noisy signals, so that we can focus on one thing at a time. But I think if you just consider the possibility that instead of sending information, some sort of encoded information, and you're simply signaling patterns, then it might be easier to think about some of the AI problems that we're working on today. Let's see, what have we got? Vision, hearing, touch, proprioception, taste are all routed through the thalamus before being sent to their respective processing centers in the cerebral cortex. So not processing centers for their pattern consolidation areas might be a better term in the cortex. Not just the messenger for our eyes and ears that receives feedback, which helps it filter sensory information in real time. Okay, so probably done that one to death, but I think the concept of using these types of resources is very helpful for cognitive scientists and artificial intelligence practitioners, because this is what the brain is actually doing. Maybe not in exquisite detail in this type of website, but there's an awful lot of expertise in the world about how all of these components of our body works. It's just a medical necessity. So let's move on from that look at the brain to just some comparisons of earlier types of brains. So here's a comparison of different animal brains. This is from Pinterest. Interesting. So it's just an image of a human brain. What have we got here? A macaque monkey. I don't even know how to pronounce that. Capybara, squirrel monkey, and then these tiny ones, smoky shrew. The point that I'd make, guinea pig, is that this 3.7 gram brain compared to the human 1.5 kilo brain, guinea pigs still have things that exceed our AI capabilities. They move around, they can climb, they can go through mazes, they can go navigate around their environment to survive. That presumably they would run away from whatever would eat a guinea pig. So these tiny little brains are doing all of that capability. And so the human brain, which is adding on a whole bunch of things, particularly for language and the things that go with language, our brains are absolutely enormous by comparison. And the animal AI, which is probably the right distinction to make, animal AI like vision, hearing, motion, touch, dealing with simple situations. Animal AI is probably the first problem to solve, and then language understanding, which sits on top of it in the human brain, you can almost say that NLU, language understanding, is intelligence. So now you're into artificial intelligence instead of simply emulating what lots of animals can do. But I think that it's just worth making that distinction. And by the way, when we talk about artificial intelligence, there's some pretty stupid people that still speak language. So depending on what you think intelligence means, even the concept of saying language is intelligent is perhaps not the right term. It's a capability, as is these other types of animal capabilities. Rita Carter. This is one of my favorite research books, Mapping the Mind. This is a 1998 book, I think, and Rita Carter wrote there's a lot of very nice pictures about the brain, and in this book you can see I've just copied these to show you: fish brain, reptilian brain, mammalian brain, human brain. It's not showing you the components here, but the components in a human brain all map back to these. Obviously, the eyes haven't changed a whole lot. I mean, there's obviously biological differences as we've evolved, but the concept of I think that's your nasal detectors, your sense of smell. Human one's under there somewhere. I think it's there. Yeah, it's just kind of cool. So the brains have continued on, and then the new functions are on top of it. And these fish brains do an awful lot. An AI machine to replicate that today is also out of our reach, and they're tiny. So let's keep at it, guys. Here's another one. This is from the NIH PubMed. I like these online resources because you can read a lot of detail about the research that people have done. This is looking at fishes, the reptilian brain. But you can see here that fish have cerebellums, the orange bits. Lizards and snakes, there's a cerebellum. There's one in, I think that's a bird, and there's a mammal. And then the human one is that huge structure at the back of our brains. And then we've got a cerebrum that's I think made up of it's part of this telencephalon. The purple bit, there's the midbrain that becomes quite small comparatively in humans. So the brain anatomy, there's a lot that we can learn from other animals, and the capabilities are worth emulating if we can. Here's Wikipedia, vertebrate brain. What are we seeing here? Here's a comparison between a shark and a human. So sharks here, there's the piece that becomes our cerebrum, or part of that becomes our cerebrum, cerebellum, this piece here in a shark, pons and medulla, brain stem elements there in the human. And one of my theories is that people have focused a lot on consciousness as the height of human capability. I'll do a separate video on that soon. The idea that consciousness is the pinnacle, perhaps it's not. Perhaps the brainstem and early animals all have consciousness as one of the survival benefits. And honestly, while I'm talking to you now, I'm not consciously aware of anything that I'm doing. I'm obviously speaking, but my brain's controlling all of that. And I'm aware of it in retrospect consciously. So why would we say that consciousness is the controlling center? It's actually a distributed capability of our brain by controlling all of the patterns through this hierarchical model that our brain implements. So there's a couple more brains, and let's see, what have we got here? I think this is kind of cute. Semicircular canal. So our sense of balance is very important. If you have damage to your semicircular canals, I think you can feel quite sick because you feel unbalanced, and your skills in walking and moving around are severely impaired. And sharks are quite old in the evolutionary scale of things. They don't have solid bones. They've got cartilage for bones. So here's a shark with its semicircular canals. Here's earlier types of animals: a hagfish, a lamprey, and a zebrafish. Hagfish only has one semicircular canal. I it looks like. So the point is that the transducers are very old and have evolved an awful lot longer than the human cerebrum. So let's get into the science here. So the whole point is, what is it that AI is looking to do, and what did Yann Lecun's recent interview say about it? So this is from ZDNet. When was this? September 24th, 2022. There's Yann. He's looking pretty happy. Meta's chief AI scientist. And of course, Meta owns Facebook and a couple of other very big IT companies. He's saying, let's see, you have to step back and say, well, we've built this ladder, but we want to go to the moon, and there's no way this ladder is going to get us there. So Lecun is being critical of AI to get to the types of things that all of us in the AI field are striving to achieve. Let's see, Facebook, Instagram, and WhatsApp is the companies owned by Meta. We'll have a look at this think piece that he wrote. I'll only look at the beginning, but definitely go to the comment section and go to these articles, because there's some good information in it. Okay, implied if not articulated in the paper is the contention that most of today's big projects in AI will never be able to reach that human level goal. So do we I think they say here that it can be contentious. He views with great skepticism many of the most successful avenues of research in deep learning at the moment. I think they're necessary but not sufficient, the Turing Award winner said. Those include large language models such as GPT-3, the transformer-based system. And yeah, well, let me read it. So, we tokenize everything and train gigantic models to make discrete predictions, and somehow AI will emerge from this. So the reason for showing you a brain is GPT-3, if it's simply taking word sequences and combining them based on letter sequences that it's pulling out of big data, then there's an awful lot of stuff missing, and people that have lost access to the meaning, the semantic side of their brains through damage to Wernicke's area, they've lost understanding, and so they can still speak, but they speak things that don't mean much. And as a result, and by the way, you can read up on Wernicke's area to get a slightly more detailed analysis of what's going on there. Wernicke's area is people without meaning still able to speak somewhat. You can imagine with an artificial system like GPT-3, it's got the capability of remembering all of these sentence fragments, and therefore it does a better job at putting together something that makes sense. But GPT-3 has the same problem of, I think it's confabulation, where it's saying things that aren't true, as a person with Wernicke's aphasia might say. Okay, so Lecun says they're not wrong in the sense that that may be a component of a future intelligent system, but I think it's missing essential pieces. It's a startling critique of what appears to work coming from the scholar who perfected the use of convolutional neural networks, CNNs, a practical technique that's been incredibly productive in deep learning programs. Lecun sees flaws and limitations in plenty of other highly successful areas of the discipline. Reinforcement learning will also never be enough, he maintains. Researchers such as David Silver of DeepMind, who developed the AlphaZero program that mastered chess, shogi, and Go, are focused on programs that are, quote, very action-based, observes Lecun. But most of the learning we don't do it by actually taking actions, we do it by observing. And there's the learning versus innate challenge. Well, what are we learning? If your eyes are connected to a part of your brain, and then that part of your brain innately does certain things, then as your eyes are moving around seeing stuff, your brain is learning stuff. But the things that it's learning, at some point very early on, you're recognizing objects, and those objects then have to be connected to all of your sensory apparatus. So the way the brain does it is the thing to emulate, not necessarily just the things that we're doing today in these types of projects. Lecun says, we see a lot of claims as to what we should do to push forward towards human-level AI, and there are ideas which I think are misdirected. We're not at the point where our intelligent machines have as much common sense as a cat, so why don't we start there? This is, yeah, I won't read all of it, but it says here that his faith in generative networks that predict the next frame in a video have been a complete failure. And there's some religious probabilists out there that think probability theory is the only framework you can use to explain machine learning. And obviously that's not true. I mean, the counterexample is the human brain, where I can argue that it's not a probabilistic system at all. I know that neurons themselves have what looks like a probabilistic nature, but with the forward and backwards projections between regions, I think that simplistic view of what the brain's doing in total is misguided. Okay, so great article there. Let's have a look at his detailed paper. So this is called A Path Towards Autonomous Machine Learning, June 27th, 2022. So it's pretty current, because what's the date now? We're in nearly November 2022. So he's saying it's not technically nor scholarly in the traditional sense, but a position paper expressing his vision for a path towards intelligent machines that learn more like animals and humans, that can reason and plan, and whose behavior is driven by intrinsic objectives rather than by hardwired programs, external supervision, or external rewards. I mean, the idea of training a vision system based on rewards seems unusual, because my eyes don't feel very rewarded very often. Introduction. So I've looked at this, and here's the three main challenges that AI research must address today. Number one, how can machines learn to represent the world, learn to predict, and learn to act largely by observation? So the innateness part is important here. So the eye isn't just a random device. It's not a video camera that's projecting light back into the brain. It's actually got a whole bunch of neurons that are doing quite complicated things, and the output of that is signaling into the brain. And as we said, it gets split and left. Half of one of the eyes goes to one side of the brain, and the other half goes to the other side of the brain. So there's an interesting crossover taking place. It's a complex transducer, and if you simply wanted to take the output of a camera and replicate all of that in code, you have to remember that that's a very early structure with maybe 1.5 billion years of evolution. A long time. So if you're not studying what that's doing, it might be an awful lot of trial and error before you start to master what the eye is doing. And then when that's projecting onto the brain, and we're getting these other types of vision functions like the detection of motion, the detection of color, and then the forward projections into objects, because we definitely, I know I can recognize the objects in the world, like that pen again. And so the ability to do that is a function of my brain. I don't think I'm learning that in the sense of I don't think the controller is much more than these things are happening at the same time, and through experience I'm able to connect the fact that my hands are feeling something in the position that I'm holding it. My vision's able to connect to that. My hearing is able to recognize the click as I'm clicking it, and in fact the motion to do the clicking of the pen is all integrated into the motion sensors in my body, my somatosensory cortex and motor cortex working together with the cerebellum, etc., in order to make all of that fine motor control work. So that's a big ask, that number one, and probably not worth laboring the point too much more on that. So that's a good challenge. If we can do all of that, I don't think we're predicting in any case. The prediction model is one of the common models in neuroscience, and I think prediction's not what brains are doing. We're actually learning through pattern matching, and we predict in the sense that when we see things again, or when we experience things, we're comparing it to the patterns we previously stored, and based on the previously stored patterns that led to something, we can say, oh, last time it led to that, there's my prediction. But the concept of prediction's a very airy-fairy concept, where you can say, well, I dropped this cup, it's going to fall. Well, okay, but I'm not predicting it through mathematical models. I'm predicting it because that's what happens when I drop anything on Earth. And the paradigm is important. The scientific model is important. Second point: how can machines reason and plan in ways that are compatible with gradient-based learning? So I set this one up at the beginning. So the reason I said the epicycle model of the solar system is problematic is a problem, because if you say that the orbits of planets have to be circular and the Earth's not moving, it gets very hard to then realize that the sun's at the center of the solar system. The Earth is moving along with the planets, and they're moving in elliptical orbits, because I've told you have to comply with this engineering model, with this scientific model. So here, the concept that we have to use a gradient-based learning technique is really saying you can do AI, but it has to comply with this aspect of the current deep learning paradigm. And that can be risky. Patom theory, by the way, doesn't support that, because the gradient-based learning is starting from inputs, and there's a feed backwards mechanism, but it's not using regions and it's not integrating the senses. We get away with the Patom theory model in NLP, in natural language processing, because we're working with high-level patterns that are sufficient for us to know what they're supposed to do. We're not connecting them back to sensory input, because we don't have machines or transducers that do that at the moment, not to the level that we would require to do brain emulation work. So the second one, it looks like we're being asked to use deep learning as part of the solution. So that's not a good approach, in my opinion. And how can machines learn to represent percepts and action plans in a hierarchical manner at multiple levels of abstraction and multiple timescales? We cover that here. Here's the Patom theory. So this is the hierarchical model, and as we move up the hierarchy, and Patoms are storing, matching, and using hierarchical bidirectional patterns, but they're also the bidirectional nature is hierarchical by definition, and the patterns that they store are snapshots and sequences. So the sequences give you the time dependent conditions. So if the sequence takes a long time, then there'll be fewer transitions that you're capturing in that process. But ultimately it's still a sequence, and it doesn't matter whether it's a quick or a long sequence in terms of your recognition of it. So I think we can do 3 with cognitive science, with neuroscience. And then we go on to the rest of his paper. So I'm not going to go into that detail. But the point I wanted to make is that Yann is putting in some constraints which look like engineering or scientific constraints, which may well be an epicycle type limitation. And it's always hard when you're doing your own scientific work to see where your own biases are coming from. But for me, that's a bias that he might do well to eliminate. But then, not his job. Okay, limits of artificial intelligence. This comes from Dreyfus, and my Dreyfus book is in worse shape than all my other books, because the cardboard in the book is actually completely failed. It's turning into dust on my desk. So I've just grabbed this extract from it, this scan, and there's just a couple of points that Hubert Dreyfus back in the 70s was really in the thick of the AI explosion that was going on at that time, and there were a lot of debates. Should it be what's now deep learning connectionist type architecture? Should it be a purely symbolic architecture? And he was saying, well, it's probably neither of them. And he was criticized by people like me, not that I was a big figure back in the 70s, but when I think about his arguments, I wasn't happy about them. But ultimately, in science, you have to answer your critics' questions in order for your paradigm to be picked up. Because if you can't, well, maybe you haven't got the right answer. So a couple of points he makes here. So there's 2 areas he talks about. Simulation, CS, and artificial intelligence, AI, are the 2 areas. And these days I would simply say cognitive science is the CS, so it's emulating the brain, emulating what people can do. And AI is simply doing what people can do and completely ignoring any requirement to make it human-like in the least. So with those 2 fields, does a human being processing information actually follow formal rules like a digital computer? So if you're in the deep learning side of things, machine learning side of things, I think the argument is that no, the rules-based systems failed in the past. If you're a symbolic person, you would probably say, well, like I am, that you're able to do all of these things with symbolic architectures, with atomic architectures, because I'm arguing the brain is an atomic architecture, which by definition is symbolic. So does a human being in processing information actually follow formal rules like a digital computer? Well, no, I'm saying not. And can human behavior, no matter how generated, be described in a formalism which can be manipulated by a digital machine? And I'd say yes, because what we're doing with our language system is we're wiring up a semantic network. So we're using this the associations in our semantic network that are similar to the ones that, well, what a semanticist says the semantic network looks like, and we're still able to use a computer program to run that. We're abstracting one level away from what most people would think of as a computer program, but you can still run it on computer. But these are his serious questions, and I'm not going to go into the detail of any of these, but I think there's a good point at the bottom here, which is in the face of these difficulties, workers in artificial intelligence want to justify their optimism. The burden of proof is henceforth on them, and that's the bottom line. The whole point of solving AI is to convince people that this is a good solution. It's probably better to have working language understanding systems that are really effective as part of your justification for saying, by the way I've done this, in my case, it's a symbolic architecture using Patom theory, and you can see what it does. And the reason it does it that way is because of the brain, and you can see that it's working. So this is my justification, my proof that this is a good approach. And if you compare, as I did in one of my recent articles, things that are going on with automatic speech recognition, you have to say, well, that's a little bit disappointing because I can't talk to a machine today and have it accurately transcribe in general. And for a lot of the applications that I'm trying to use, I can't use voices as the interface because it's not reliable enough. It forces me to completely repeat what I've said. Teachers in another area, which has been one of the big areas of AI success, translation. In translation, we can go between many languages using an automated technique. But you can't use the output of those in school to teach that language because it's not accurate enough. And if you see the transcription services that are supported by machines today, a lot of the rhyming errors that they come out with aren't really good enough if we cared about that as the input to our AI system. So if the measure of success is replicating the problems that we need to replicate, then we haven't been as successful as we'd like to be. And if we keep focusing on the goal that a person in the street would say, yeah, that's great, then we finally achieved our objectives in the AI field. And I believe cognitive science needs to be brought in more and more to take what we know the brain is doing and perhaps how the brain's doing it and applying it to our models to see if we can get a big step change from today's technology to what people expect. So I'll leave it at that point. Thanks for joining me today, and I look forward to seeing you again soon. Bye for now.